As we move into why we're here today, I want to acknowledge that we celebrated Veterans Day yesterday, and I wanted to take just a moment of silence to pay our respects. We send out our thanks to all who have served. When we first met in September, over 175,000 people in the United States had died due to COVID, and 2 months later, over 221,000 people have died. This pandemic continues and will continue to take the lives of our family, our friends, and our colleagues. Although there are signs of hope that in the coming months there'll be change, we'll have a vaccine, this continues to be an unprecedented time of stress and loss. And as a community, we'd really like to come together in the next few days to learn and grow while remaining sensitive to others and to our own experiences. So we developed these two institutes to help us learn how we can build and nurture our grief and sensitivity skills for ourselves and our loved ones, for our colleagues, and for those that we serve. We're holding this second institute this week for two reasons. So in addition to extending learning from our first session in September to deepen our practice of grief sensitivity, we're also, between the holidays of Veterans Day and Thanksgiving and this approaching winter season, Veterans Day is certainly a time to honor those who have served in the U.S. Armed Forces, all the heroes and sheroes who have given their strength and support to our nation. And we're also approaching Thanksgiving and other holidays, which we know can be a time where grief and the absence of so many we have lost will certainly evoke new needs and new ways of being grief sensitive. On behalf of the network, I'd like to extend our deep thanks to the team that brought you this institute and the one in September. Great staff from 7 of our centers have been working over the past few months to pull this together, and you'll be meeting them again over the next 2 days. A few particular shout outs to Leora Wolf-Person at the Pacific Southwest MHTTC for her vision and leadership. Jennifer Barron-Prawl from South-Southwest MHT for keeping us all organized and moving forward. Jessica Gonzalez, Ricky Canello, Felicia Benson, and Andrea Aliotto from my team at the Network Coordinating Office for their outstanding technical work to make this a reality. And a note of appreciation for all of our incredible faculty who are national leaders in grief work. We are honored to have had you in September and back again in November. Today and tomorrow, our sessions focus on applying concepts to practice. So again, we've brought back our faculty from September to go more in depth in applying what we learned to how we engage and sit with our clients. So the Institute has 4 sessions. Each of those has 3 learning tracks: grief sensitivity, evidence-based and culturally defined practices, and school mental health. So join whichever session best fits your learning interests. There's also optional breakout sessions divided by track. Again, choose the one that most fits your interests. The breakouts are really for discussion and learning from one another on a deeper level. And they were really great in September. I felt like people made a lot of connections with each other, which was really heartening to see. A quick jump to tomorrow, then join us at 9 a.m. Pacific for a quick collective opening, and we'll be guided by our faculty, Doug Smith, on tips to navigate grief during the holidays. We close day 2 in our entire institute tomorrow with listening and loving. A panel of young people, you may remember them from September. They were really amazing and really helped us to end on this note of hope. So don't miss that tomorrow. Getting back to today, we're going to open with a keynote to set the tone, and then we have session 1 track learning, followed by that optional breakout during the lunchtime. So looking forward to those sessions today. There are many ways over the next 2 days and beyond to extend your learning on grief. In addition to the Institute, please check out our fact sheet series, as well as our Responding to COVID-19 Grief, Loss, and Bereavement webpage for more events from our network and resources. Oops. I also wanted to acknowledge that just as many of us are clinicians and providers and peer leaders, we're also all experiencing turmoil and loss related to the COVID pandemic, the election, racial violence, natural disasters, all the stressors in our lives. And many of us are dealing with personal loss due to the death of loved ones. Participating in this institute may activate your own feelings of grief and loss. Please care for yourself during the next 2 days, including taking breaks, stretching, drinking water, practicing mindfulness, whatever helps you stay centered and grounded. If you feel in need of acute support, here are some links to helplines and hotlines, and these are also on our website. To start today's Institute, I'd like to warmly welcome back Dr. Katherine Shear, who will set the stage with the keynote presentation, Using Healing Milestones in Your Work. Dr. Shear is founder and director of the Center for Complicated Grief. She is an internist, a psychiatrist, but has the heart of a social worker, I should say, and has the heart of a social worker. She's widely recognized for her work in bereavement studies and complicated grief disorder. Dr. Shear developed a key evidence-based practice, complicated grief therapy, CGT, which is very strong evidence across several funded randomized clinical trials. Dr. Shear is the Marion E. Kenworthy Professor of Psychiatry at Columbia School of Social Work and Columbia College of Physicians and Surgeons. We are very thankful for Dr. Shear's work in the field and welcome you, Dr. Shear, to present for us this morning.
Thanks so much, Heather, and thanks to you and, and all of your team for putting this together. This this whole institute, and for everything else you do. I know you do a lot of other things too. So it's really a great pleasure to be here today and to follow up on our discussion from last September. So I am going to talk today about using our model, which we call healing milestones, in work. And I'm going to be a little bit broad-based about this, but sort of give you what I hope are some useful suggestions that you might be able to incorporate into your work. So I want to start actually by talking just for a minute about grief and loss and grief, only because that's what we're talking about here, right? We're talking about grief therapy. We're talking about recognizing and intervening in a helpful way. And if I'm going to tell you anything meaningful, we have to be on the same page about what we mean by that, basically by that. And so one of the things we all know is that loss of a loved one is probably the greatest stressor that we experience in our life, that it brings many, many challenges, difficulties, and threats, and affects us physically and mentally in very, very deep and broad ways. There's some examples on this slide. And in addition, loss of a loved one is going to trigger grief. We really consider grief to be the response to loss. And again, on this slide, there's some sort of statements about what grief is like. It's not one thing, of course. It's not just an emotion. It's got thoughts and feelings and behaviors and a spiritual side as well. And it's not also one thing because it doesn't stay the same. It changes, and it changes kind of erratically. It also evolves over time, and it's affected by things that happen that are unpredictable and out of our control often. The interesting thing is that grief itself is often stressful too, because there are a lot of confusing thoughts and mixed feelings that occur very naturally during that process of just reacting to or responding to the loss of someone close. And I'm not going to walk through each one of these. I think you will get the slides, but I think you can also read this and know that, these are things that almost everyone experiences at least briefly, and sometimes in a very, very frustrating or troubling way. So what we say at the Center for Complicated Grief is that when someone close dies, grief is the form that love takes. It's the form that love for the person takes. And it's also a stress response. So let's talk a minute about that, because coping is very important in grief. So coping is how we manage stress. And in the grief field, those of you who are already doing grief work are probably familiar with the idea of the dual process model of coping with bereavement, put forward more than a decade ago now by Maggie Strobe and H.E.A.L.I.N.G. And basically what they said was, up until their writing, people tended to say, you have to um, deal with your grief and then move on. You have to experience grief and then resolve it and then you move on. And they said, wait a second, that doesn't make any sense because that's stressful in and of itself. And there's also the stress of all the other things that happen in association with that loss. And we actually have to deal with stressors related to the loss and those related to restoration of some kind of a life or really related to our daily life. Those stressors, we need to deal with them, and we need to deal with them kind of at the same time. How we deal with them is very variable. It can be problem focused, it can be emotion focused, it can be active or avoidant. I'm not going to get into a lot of details about that, but what's important is that we have to do both more or less in tandem. They said, oscillate between dealing with a stressor related to the loss and dealing with a stressor related to daily life. But there's another thing that happens in addition to being stressful. Bereavement in general, it tends to turn our lives upside down. It turns the world upside down. It changes in a very dramatic way the world that we live in. And that's a kind of different, it can be very stressful. It is very stressful, but the stresses that we deal with that accompany this are kind of in the moment, day-to-day stresses, whereas adapting is a process of adjusting expectations and behavior to fit the changes in the world that we live in. And we do this in an ongoing way. Living things do this in an ongoing way. It's part of what it means to be a living thing, is that we're constantly kind of adjusting and changing our expectations and behavior as the world around us, be it the social world or the physical world or both, change. So adapting is something that's sort of very much needed, and it's a long-term kind of process, and it happens both in ways that we are aware of and also in some ways that we're not aware of, that are kind of facilitated by what these social psychologists, Dan Gilbert and Timothy Wilson, call the psychological immune system, which they see as being out of awareness, sort of implicit processes that protect our psychological well-being in a way somewhat analogous to the way our physical immune system protects our physical well-being. So I want to point out that coping and adapting are different. They are related to each other. Certainly, there are stresses that need to be dealt with in order to facilitate that adaptive process, and adapting does help relieve stress. So they're kind of connected, but they are different. I think it's useful to think of them as different. And what we're going to be doing is focusing primarily on adapting because we think that's what people really need. Now, sometimes early in grief or at any point in grief, someone is really having trouble coping with a specific stressor, and that is something we would want to pay attention to in grief. But what I'm going to talk to you about today, this morning, in this relatively brief talk, is about ways that we try to promote adapting to loss. So these are some of the differences. Coping is kind of, I think, well illustrated by the two images. It's really kind of propping things up for the moment, getting back on track, relieving pain, and it tends to use our resources, whereas adapting is a more long-term process that really prepares us to flourish, prepares us to be able to live as well as possible in a changed world. And it tends to build resources rather than use them. So what do we mean by adapting to loss? And this is something that we've known for, I think, quite a long time, and many people talk about in one way or another. And this is our particular version of this, but that we really have to, in order to adapt, we have to be able to really fully accept the reality, that new reality, that changed reality. If we don't accept it, if we're fighting against it in some way, or if we're resisting it in some way, then it's going to be very hard for us to kind of adjust to changes that we don't want or don't think are happening because we're resisting them. So that what we mean by the reality is the finality of the loss, the changed relationship that we have. Some people call this the continuing bonds, but from the adapting side, it's the changes in the relationship with the person who died and all the other changes that accompany the loss, and also the permanence of grief, because grief really doesn't ever fully go away. It varies how much it kind of quiets and sort of softens as we move forward, but it doesn't really ever completely leave. And then the other piece of adapting is restoring that capacity for well-being, which is undermined, very often undermined pretty extensively by bereavement. So we need to find a renewed sense of autonomy, competence, and relatedness, which is what's said on this slide. So just to summarize one more time, grief emerges in an acute form with strong emotions and insistent, even intrusive thoughts about the person who died, many of them positive, but they're still intrusive. They still are pretty strong. And also grief-related behaviors and physical symptoms. And the other thing that's important about grief is that it's often accompanied by challenges which we consider to be natural stopping places in that process of adapting. And they're listed, some of them, some of the most common ones are listed here. And you can see that these are stopping places because we kind of have to come to terms with the sense of disbelief. It's almost always present, and the protest is almost always present, at least in a fleeting way. And that in counterfactual thinking, meaning the way that we have alternative, we imagine alternative scenarios for the death itself, some different ways that things could have happened. This is, sometimes we call this if only thinking or what if thinking. That's technically counterfactual thinking. There's been a lot of research about it. It's something that is very, very natural to happen. Probably we all have it, at least fleetingly again. And we also many times don't understand grief. We don't understand what's happening. We want it to go away because it's painful, but we also, and disruptive to our life, but we also want to hold on to it because we understand it as a link to the person who died. We often are tend to blame people. Almost everyone has survivor guilt. These kinds of, all of this is really very common and very natural, but we have to deal with it. This doesn't kind of just kind of flow forward for the most part, at least some of these. And I'm going to come back to this. It's pretty important. So, but as we do adapt, grief is softened, it's transformed and integrated into our lives. And as that happens, it just kind of, it sort of recedes in importance. So it stops being the center of our life and becomes much more in the background. But I do want to say, and this is sometimes a source of confusion for people, that even when this happens, even when we have adapted very well to a loss and we are living our lives in a meaningful way and in a way that we can feel a strong sense of well-being, there can be times, and Heather kind of alluded to this, when grief can be triggered, and it can be triggered in a pretty intense way, even though everything is going okay. And that would be times like the upcoming family holidays, sometimes the anniversary of the death will do this. Calendar days really will tend to trigger grief. And then sometimes, running into an old friend that you haven't seen in maybe years or even decades, and they don't know that this person died, and all of a sudden it just floods back in. Those kinds of experiences can do it. And life events, specific life events. And of course, this, we're in this time, as everyone's been saying, when there's a likelihood of being triggered, even for people who have really made peace with the death of someone close. So some people like this. I kind of like, I think visually, so this is a summary of what I just said. It's just a visual summary. And why I said that we want to kind of think about these stopping places, because if we don't stop and sort of pay attention to them and see what we can learn from them, often we can learn something about ourselves, about our relationship with the person who died, about the person who died, or the world in general. There's a lot to be learned in the stopping places. And we do need to kind of get past those stopping places, because when we don't, they end up becoming derailers. And that is what happens, we think, in the syndrome, which we now call prolonged grief disorder, which contains a lot of the same kind of basic experiences, symptoms of acute grief, those intense emotions. A lot of, yearning and longing and sadness are at the heart of grief, but then there's virtually any other emotion you can imagine is also potentially there, comes and goes during a period of grief, and it can be very intense. It remained very intense. The thoughts and memories of the person who died can stay very, very preoccupying. It can be very hard to focus on anything else during acute grief, naturally during a period of acute grief, but it also can, people can get kind of stuck there when these stopping places become derailers. And this disorder is now official as of last week. So if we had had this webinar, this institute 2 weeks ago, I wouldn't be able to say this, but now this is actually an official diagnosis, and it will be shortly on the website. These are the criteria for it. Again, I'm not going to go through them in detail, but you can see that this requires that someone has been bereaved for at least a year, and that there is persistent and pervasive yearning, longing, and preoccupation with the person who died, and that there are at least 3 of these 8 other symptoms that they've listed here that have been present most days, and for sure during the last month. And you have to be a little careful, because if you're in one of those trigger points, that can be a little, you kind of have to factor that in. But this has been very, very carefully reviewed and gone over and studied, and there's a huge amount of research literature behind it. And it took 2 full years. We put in the proposal, the team that I lead put in this proposal in 2018, in February of 2018. And it was, like I said, last week it was finalized in this way. And it was changed quite a lot along the way. So now I want to switch to talking about how you can use this kind of thinking about grief and prolonged grief disorder in your work. So the goals of a healing milestones approach are to facilitate adaptation to loss and to find and address these stopping places and or derailers. So really, we've now started to use this, a lot of clinicians have started to use this with pretty much anyone grieving, even though its roots are in the research that we did with people who met the criteria that you just saw for prolonged grief disorder. And what we found was we compared treatment, grief therapy with a treatment for depression, and we found a very good response. This is a really good response for a randomized trial of any psychotherapy, and much better than treatment for depression. And one other word about treatment for depression, this is a little bit off track, but what you can see, what this slide shows is that we found absolutely no evidence of any helpful effect of antidepressant medication on grief symptoms, on what are called complicated grief symptoms, same thing as prolonged grief disorder symptoms, but those, and which are the same as acute grief symptoms also. No evidence of that. However, in this study, when antidepressant was added to complicated grief, the grief therapy, we did see a significant effect on depression symptoms. And a lot of people have both prolonged grief disorder and depression. So you do kind of have to pay attention to that, because that is a place where antidepressants can be helpful, just so that you know. So now let's just talk about, I'm going to end with kind of walking through a way to work with a a bereaved client. And this is a model that we've mostly used individually. Others have used it in a group format, and even in a family therapy format. So there's nothing inherently wrong with that, but obviously you would have to kind of adapt it to your own work. Excuse me. So we always start of course, any intervention, any effective intervention starts with the first meeting with the client. So, and we have to pay a lot of attention to building a relationship with that client. We want, it's quite important, as you all know, because we really can't do anything to influence anybody, to help anybody, if we don't have a pretty strong um, alliance with them, or a pretty strong relationship, and that if they don't feel safe enough to to confide in us, that's not going to work out too well. So we have to do that, and there's lots of ways to do that. We'll talk about that again in a second, but we also want to understand the context of grief. And I think a lot of times when we do grief counseling or grief therapy work, the grief is so much center stage in the person's life, and that's what they bring in, and that's what they want to talk about. And we can sometimes kind of sideline that, getting to know the client themselves and their social and cultural world. And of course, that's highly, highly important. And we won't really understand their loss and grief without having a pretty good understanding of who they are and who's in their world. But then, of course, we do want to understand their loss and grief, and we want to agree on our therapy goals, and however you approach your work. I would say that I think it's really, really a good idea to be very explicit about how you think and work in whatever way you want to model that. So in our case, we're going to be operating with 5 important underlying premises: that grief is a form of love, as I said, and it emerges naturally and finds a place in our life; that we adapt to loss also instinctively, naturally, if we don't get in our own way; that nevertheless, loss and grief are very stressful, and stress does need to be managed, because if it doesn't, it can derail adaptation. We honor the fact that even though there are certain commonalities that I'm talking a lot about, everyone grieves and copes and adapts in their own way. So if we're going to work with someone, we're going to bring to bear these general principles, but we are also going to very much need to be present with them, to be listening closely to what they have to say, and to be working with them to understand, to meet them where they are and kind of gently guide them forward. And the last thing that we keep in mind is that we don't grieve well alone. That's just, almost all cultures have various kinds of rituals or practices that are very, very common. Even our culture, which probably is one of, writ large, the culture in the United States is the Western culture generally doesn't do a great job with this, but we do still have people gather around us and support us when we're grieving, and we think this is quite important. So active listening, as you've been hearing me say, is at the heart of this approach. And what we mean by active listening is really meeting the client, connecting with the client, so that we can decide how and when to intervene. And what we're going to be thinking about in terms of making that decision also is what is the state. We're going to be kind of monitoring our relationship with the client. We're going to be watching for those derailers, and we're going to be also watching for progress or opportunities for progress that we can foster in adaptation, and even creating those opportunities, as I'll show you in a minute. And at the same time, kind of paying attention to the client's readiness and or the opposite, reticence about moving forward, and looking for opportunities to either kind of create openness to change, or certainly to exploit whatever openness to change there is. And we're going to be making decisions about whether to support, validate, or guide people, because those are the 3 ways that we personalize the intervention. Validation, we do, about grief. I've been doing it a lot in what I've said so far. Supporting, and we also are going to validate external experiences. We're going to validate the experiences people have, sometimes very difficult experiences with other people in their world, with the society at large, we know that there are many, many ways that bereaved people are not supported and are, in fact, sometimes undermined. We're definitely seeing that in the Black community in many ways. These days, we're starting to kind of wake up to that as a culture at large, something that's been going on for way too long. But that's one example. But this happens, and we want to validate it. We don't want to try to help people um, figure out their role in it, basically, which is sometimes what therapy ends up doing. And we want to be empathic, of course, and with our, that's what we do with listen, non-judgmental and empathic. And then we sometimes want to practice some kind of gentle guidance. And I'm going to end with that. So the 7 healing milestones that guide our therapy are listed here. So we want to help people understand and accept grief, manage their emotions. That means actually their painful emotions, but also their positive emotions. We want to help them start to see a little bit of promise in the future, because as we know, when someone close dies, that we're robbed of many things. That's what the word bereavement actually means. And one of them is our ability to see the future in a promising way. We want to help people strengthen feelings of relatedness, which are also very often undermined even when there are other people around who really want to support us, who really are there for us. It can sometimes be difficult to have those feelings of relatedness. And that can get more and more difficult if people do get kind of stuck in that acute grief or stuck in a way that leads to prolonged grief disorder. We want to help people tell the story of the death, learn to live with reminders, and connect with the memories of the person who died in a way that they can feel feel nourished by them, and also they can help us learn and grow. So here are some of the things we do, and that might be sort of suggestions. And these slides also, as you see, have the sort of rationale for why we want to understand grief and how we want to understand grief, and then the kinds of things we do to try to help people do that. So I'm just going to focus on those because I want to make sure that we have plenty of time for questions and discussion if you want to have it. But so in order to help people understand grief, we start by, in the very beginning, by the history that we take, by the discussion we have about their relationship with the person who died, the death itself, and what happened afterwards. That's kind of part of that initial getting to know the client and the loss. And that is the first way we learn about the their loss and grief. And it's also an opportunity for them to sort of think through how they understand the grief, because when we tell someone about it, that's part of how we do it. We also use grief monitoring, which I'll talk about more in a second, and we do a form of psychoeducation, kind of like what I did in the beginning of this talk, sort of talk about how we understand grief. And you can do that whether you use our sort of exact model of grief as a form of love and a stress as at the same time, a very big stressor, or you have some other way of talking about it and thinking about it. It's still a way to help your client understand grief. Then we want to help them manage emotions. And again, these are both painful emotions, which of course are very disruptive, can be very disruptive. We can also learn from those emotions, and we can learn how to do things that will actually help them decrease in their intensity. And one of those things actually is to allow the natural positive emotions in our lives to emerge and to be able to savor them, because one of the things we have to do is manage our positive emotions in such a way that we don't try to block them out, because survivor guilt, which is always universal, it's almost universal, will make us feel uneasy with having those positive emotions. And often people want to just sort of block them out and try to forget about them, or even try not to do things that would bring them on. And that's kind of problematic. So that's why, one has to kind of stop with that survivor guilt and think about it and work it through, somehow resolve the survivor guilt. Because of course, even though we feel a sense of discomfort, or even, we feel bad in some way to be doing positive things and having satisfaction in our lives when someone close has died, that doesn't mean that we should basically listen to that. So grief monitoring is a simple way to both help people with understanding grief and also managing emotions. And we have a way of doing this. We use you can do this with an app you can find on our website, or you can do it with a piece of paper, whatever. But we basically suggest that people take 5 minutes at the end of the day, each day, and just think back over the day to a time when grief was at its highest level and try to rate that on a 0 to 10 scale, where 10 is the most intense grief they've ever felt. And then they do the same thing, and also, I'm sorry, they rate it on that 0 to 10 scale, and they also make a little note about what was happening at the time. Then they do the same thing with the lowest level of grief, and then they sort of think back over the overall day and rate that as a high, medium, or low level. And by doing that very simple exercise, people learn a lot of things that are listed on this slide about their grief, and they also, just observing, naming, and reflecting on emotions is one way to lower their intensity. Of course, there are others, and there are others that are needed often, but this is a simple thing that I would really encourage you to try. Try it for yourself. Try it. You can do this with emotion monitoring, painful emotions, or you can do it with grief. And I think you'll find it interesting. The next thing we do is help people to try to start to imagine a promising future. And the way we do this, and we do this quite early in the approach we use. So if we're doing a, say, 6, 8, 10, or even a 16 session intervention, we do this in the second session, which may seem surprising because people are still very, very much grieving intensely at that point, and they are a little taken aback by this. But basically, by helping, what we do here is a modification of a motivational interviewing procedure, for those of you who know that, which is called personal goals. This is long-term personal goals. In motivational interviewing, it's a therapy goal, but basically what it entails is helping the client start to identify and connect with their own intrinsic values and interests, and then to let those motivate some kind of a project that they might develop. And so in doing this and bringing this in early on, not only helps the client start to orient in this way, but also is a demonstration of our confidence in the capacity of this person to do something meaningful. So I guess you have to have that confidence. I personally do, and most of the therapists who've worked with us do, because we've seen it over and over really flower when we do this kind of work. We also want to strengthen a sense of relatedness, and this is a little bit of a complex thing, because there are ways in which, when we're grieving, we have trouble opening ourselves to other people, and yet we need to. And so we do various things to try to help that. And then as time goes on, if we're not open enough, and if we're not moving forward, if we're getting more and more stuck, and people have different thresholds for this, the sort of people in our social world will have different thresholds for when they'll stop being fully supportive and start increasingly kind of try to pull us out into the world that they're living in. And when that starts to fail, people can be they can get kind of harsh and insensitive, and that can, of course, make it much harder to move through the grief and to adapt to this changed world. And so one way that we kind of go about this, and I would again strongly encourage you to consider doing this, is to invite a visitor into a session. If you're working with someone who's struggling with grief in some way, having someone there close to come in and just, it can be a time when that person will typically express their strong feelings of love and appreciation for the client. And so the client hears that, and they hear it in your presence. And so it allows you then to come back to that later and remind them of it. But it also is just a positive experience for them. You can then help the visitor understand grief and provide some information about what you're doing you're not revealing any confidential information here. This is very generic. But then you can also explore with them how could maybe the visitor be a little bit more supportive. Does the client want that? Or, that's also what we do in these sessions. And people who've been doing grief therapy for a long time have told us that this is one of the things that is different than what they usually do, and it's been, in many cases, enormously helpful. So then we do also ask people to tell the story of the death. And when we do this with people with prolonged grief disorder, we do it in a very ritualistic and intense way. But I think even in any case, inviting people to tell that story. Of course, they may or may not be open to doing that, and we don't push them. We don't, in any way push them, but we do invite them. This is, again, a gentle guidance, because sometimes they are really wanting to tell that story, but they don't want to upset the person that they're talking to. They don't know whether they should tell it. They don't know whether it's going to be helpful to them or not. And we've found it to be pretty uniformly helpful. In fact, very often people tell us that this is the single thing that has been most helpful to them in this whole healing milestones model. That isn't, it is activating, it is difficult, and you need to be present and just accept that, because we can't change the pain, really. We can't change the pain of a loss. The person themselves can cope with it and adapt to it and in their own way, but we can't do that for them, and we have to remember that it's not something we want to try to do. Often people are kind of avoiding things that trigger intense grief, and those are very often the reminders of the loss. And that might be things that the person did with the person who died, or it might be doing new things that the person never did. Either one of those can trigger painful grief, surges, and so people may be avoiding them. And we've found also that over the long run, this is not something that it can be very adaptive in terms of managing the stresses of grief, to do exactly that, to avoid confronting it, to avoid the pain. In fact, we think that this is something that has been known for a long time, that we naturally, our minds will kind of um, oscillate between confronting that pain and avoiding it, setting it aside, escaping from it, whatever. That's perfectly fine. But over the long run, finding ways to address the avoidance is a good idea. And lastly, and we do this last, and it's a little counterintuitive to do it last, because what the person comes in wanting more than anything else when they're grieving is to feel connected to the person who died. And it's a kind of a paradox that the best way we can feel connected to someone who's gone is to fully accept the fact that they are gone, that they have died. That's really the door to doing that. So this is all I really want to say, that working with healing milestones is a way of fostering our innate capacity to adapt to loss, which I think really we all have and we want to honor. And as Helen Keller said, although the world is full of suffering, it is also full of overcoming it. And that's really what we're about at the Center for Complicated Grief. And if you want to learn more about what we do, if you want to get updates, you can find a lot of information, including some free handouts and webinars, and also our training materials on our website, which is listed here. So thank you very much for your attention, and I hope there's time for questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Shear, for your grounding and foundational teaching. This truly catalyzed us into the Institute today. Unfortunately, we don't have time for a question and answer period this morning, but if you do have any follow-up questions for our presenters or our program staff, please feel free to email the network office at mhttcnetwork.org. In closing, we ask that you please take a moment to complete a brief survey about today's session. Your feedback is very important to us. You will be redirected to the survey when you close this Zoom platform, or you can use the following link or QR code on your screen right now.
And you can feel free to contact us at the Center for Complicated Grief if you have questions also from this presentation. And thank you so much.